what it's like reporting in India with someone of your background.
While I stand out in India, and I don't stand out racially in the UK, I bring to the UK this 5 years that I've had here. And it is such it's a window through which I will see the world forever. And the UK now has a Prime Minister of Indian descent, so does Ireland. Scotland has a First Minister of Pakistani descent. And what I love is that if there is a Scottish independence referendum, you will have an Indian and a Pakistani negotiating the partition of Britain.
Are people disappointed when they want to attack the New York Times, which is the latest punching bag for everybody? And you're not white, you're not even American, you're Afghan. So to what extent do you have to be careful about what you report and at the same time do justice to journalism?
We don't necessarily let that drive our coverage. We're aware of it to make sure it drives our accuracy, at least. That if a challenge and a pushback we face is because we deliberately chose a story and reported it the way we wanted to, rather than we had a mistake that somebody picked out, and the trouble we face is because of a mistake. So in a way, it keeps us on our toes more.
For New York Times to, be told to go, would be in some sense, foreign officers would get involved. But for an individual, would anyone? So in that sense, do you feel a little more vulnerable than the rest here?
I think I definitely feel a lot more vulnerable in terms of not having institutional backing. I think it's common knowledge that there have been issues with visas, with foreign journalists having access to certain areas in India. And I think it has felt like if I put a foot wrong, then the repercussions of that, perhaps I wouldn't get the backing of an institution. So yes, I think it comes back to self-censorship in a way.
Avani, you do tell us about specifically your take on the entire Bollywood as propaganda.
Yeah, well, so that documentary, it was about, the broader story, or a big part of the India story, is obviously these issues and questions around democracy and criticisms around the silencing of dissent. And Bollywood seems like a really key case study of that happening and how that's shifting, and filmmakers feeling really under pressure. And obviously someone like Vivek Agnihotri making these films that are accused of being propaganda and so on. So we went behind the scenes with him on his latest film. It was a really weird day. And then we did an interview with him, and you can see it all in the story. But he asked me to leave, which was also an extremely awkward interaction. And you see it also. He sort of threatens us afterwards and says there'll be repercussions if you put that out there.
Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for the wonderful turnout we've had at the Media Rumble. I want to again just apologize because of the shrinking space in journalism. We've taken the smaller hall, but we didn't think it would get full up the way it has. So notes for next year. Those of you who've had to watch it downstairs on screens, I know you came here for the live experience, but we'll make sure this doesn't happen next year. So thank you all for making the time. I had some very interesting conversations with the panel before we actually appeared here. And there have been such interesting, unique experiences to each while we're clubbing all of this as, foreigners in India, Western media, the enemy. But there are some very interesting, unique experiences as well. So I hope we can pack all those in the 40 minutes we have. But let me start off with Lauren, because she is just finishing a stint in India with the National Public Radio, and I'm hooked on their podcasts. I'm going to start hers. It is on the whole Love Jihad project. It's called Love Commandos. So check it out on your drive home. And you're going from India to what you describe as the heart of empire, London. So while conducting your work here in this always defensive, you're going to be perceived as this white woman coming to report on a previously colonized country and approaching everything with your guards up. Now going with both fists swinging to cover the Kohinoor diamonds future or whatever it was. Do tell us that experience and what it's like reporting in India with someone of your background?
Yeah. Thank you so much. I guess I would say I am always aware, living in India, that I have a white face and I've arrived in a country with an Anglo-colonial past, and there are going to be people who judge me before they read a word or hear a word of my work, and that's fair. I'm not from India, and so I think I worked really hard to try to overcome that, and I was always aware of that and of privilege. I shifted to London in May after 5 years based in Mumbai. Had to tear me away from this place. I feel like I've just scratched the surface after 5 years. But yeah, the first story I did in London was about the Kohinoor diamond, and the last assignment I did here was to go down to Telangana and go to the mine where the alluvial mine where the diamond was found. And then a week later, I was in the Tower of London looking at the crown jewels in line with hundreds and hundreds of Indians whispering, "This is ours." And it was too sensitive to bring out for the coronation in May, which was I arrived just before the coronation. So, but I think that, while I stand out in India, and I don't stand out racially in the UK, I bring to the UK this 5 years that I've had here. And it is it's a window through which I will see the world forever. And the UK now has a Prime Minister of Indian descent, so does Ireland. Scotland has a First Minister of Pakistani descent. And what I love is that if there is a Scottish independence referendum, you will have an Indian and a Pakistani negotiating the partition of Britain. So I look forward to covering that.
Right. Let me come to the gentleman who heads the New York Times in India. Going by what Lauren just said, are people disappointed when they want to attack the New York Times, which is the latest punching bag for everybody? And you're not white. You're not even American, you're Afghan. So they can't even say go to Pakistan.
They do say that sometimes.
So, but seriously, New York Times has, and we'll come to some more details later, it is what epitomizes the conspiracy. And to an extent, I guess, the coverage of New York Times will have to balance, I'm assuming, I'm speculating, there has been a history. You yourself said one of your correspondents and colleagues was expelled from Pakistan about a decade ago. The Time magazine experience here of about 20 years ago. To what extent do you have to, A, be careful about what you report, just because you got to stay here to report, and at the same time do justice to journalism?
I mean, it's a daily challenge that we grapple with. We don't necessarily let that drive our coverage. We're aware of it to make sure it drives our accuracy, at least. That if a challenge and a pushback we face is because we deliberately chose a story and reported it the way we wanted to, rather than we had a mistake that somebody picked out, and the trouble we face is because of a mistake. So in a way, it keeps us on our toes more. In a very complex place where stories are layered, access to information, at least on issues of policy and issues that relate to Delhi, is difficult. In that space, it's not so much a balancing act, but it is something that keeps us alert to make sure we avoid mistakes as much as possible. Because it is a space where the smallest mistake you make is then weaponized against you in a way that it questions your credibility. To come back from it is difficult. So not so much a balancing act. Just, in a way, I think it's good because it means it focuses us even more on accuracy and sensitivity. We, I think, have become, or trying to become, a lot more sensitive to places we cover. That doesn't mean we hold back punches. That doesn't mean we tone down our stories. But what we are aware of now is that we're not writing in a bubble. That 20 years ago, 30, 40 years ago, you could have dropped the New York Times correspondent in a corner of the world, and whatever story that person sent home, it stayed in a bubble. That is not the case anymore. What we write from here is read here, is read around the world. The sensitivity we need to bring to that story means we have to be accurate. We will still be shallow. I have to say, and because we get this criticism a lot, being shallow, I don't think is a great sin, because the nature of what we do, we have to appeal to the lowest common denominator in terms of readership. We write to people who might not know anything about the issues that we're writing about. We have to reduce the complexity of stories a lot of times. But that is not an excuse to be inaccurate. So the balance that we face in that, so in the new nature, the new space that we write in means we have to be sensitive, we have to be on our toes to be accurate, but it doesn't mean we hold back out of fear that we may get kicked out of this country, or we may not get our visas reduced. It just means in that tight space, we have to get creative so we don't sound like broken records, because every issue that we write about repeats every week in this space. How do we do that? That's a challenge. We fail at it a lot of times. We do it well a lot of times. So those are the issues that we grapple with. But the issue of whether we're going to stay in the country, whether we get kicked out of the country, that's not so much that drives our coverage.
Right. So, and of course, you have to be shallow. Otherwise, a deep dive podcast wouldn't be a thing, right? You got to have a lot of
maybe
deep dives. So, Catherine, you are unique in this lot because you are not associated. I mean, you are associated, but you are not full-time employee of any organization. So, you don't have, in that sense, an organizational backing. So, it's not like they have to throw the New York Times out, or they have to throw, Deutsche Welle out, or they have to, throw ABC or NPR out. It's just you. So in that sense, you're more vulnerable. So do address that, because that is unique to you. And I have a add-on question. Since you cover public health, and during the COVID crisis, the New York Times, our biggest enemy because of that front page photograph of the burning pyres, which got a lot of criticism, not just by local media, but even people associated with the ruling party and with the government. You covered public health. For New York Times to, be told to go would be in some sense, foreign officers would get involved. But for an individual, would anyone? So in that sense, do you feel a little more vulnerable than the rest here?
Yeah, I think I definitely, is this working? Is the mic working? I think I definitely feel a lot more vulnerable in terms of not having institutional backing. I think it's common knowledge that there have been issues with visas, with foreign journalists having access to certain areas in India, and I think it has felt like if I put a foot wrong, then the repercussions of that perhaps I wouldn't get the backing of an institution in terms of them helping me out, or perhaps there being more of a public outcry if I were to lose a visa or to get kicked out. So yes, I think it comes back to self-censorship in a way. I think I have never personally had issues with visas. I have found the government to be very open in terms of communication, but I think the fact that I know that those problems exist and other journalists have faced issues for them means that I am quite cautious, perhaps in terms of thinking about the stories that I'm covering. Thinking even about appearing on this panel today. It is something I gave second considerations to. So yeah, it is a tricky line to walk being a freelance journalist. Having said that, perhaps you're like a little bit more under the radar in terms of some of the stories that you cover. So there are pros and cons, I guess. When it comes to COVID, I think that really, it was it exemplifies the problems within journalism in India generally. It was such a visible thing. It was such an important story to be covering. And obviously it was something that I wanted to go out and do the big stories. But then there was such a public backlash to some of those stories. So it was a question of how much do I want to put myself out there and like put my personal circumstances on the line for those stories. So yeah, it is a tricky balancing act sometimes. And I do want to emphasize as well that I haven't actually faced personal issues. It's just the kind of the climate of knowing that other people have that makes you second guess everything, I think.
Don't worry, India will find something for everybody. Avani, you made that documentary film about Bollywood's transformation as a propaganda vehicle with some of the films that are coming out. And you did that interview with my favorite interviewee, Vivek Agnihotri, who has since never agreed to appear with me, much as I have begged him. I mean, you know, I would have loved to have that film screened here. And we were talking about a certain level of, you know, some certain level of censorship that you put in yourself, knowing the circumstances the foreign correspondents work with. Do tell us about specifically your take on the entire Bollywood as propaganda, and to what extent do you also feel a little genuinely underprepared to report on something, you know, like Mujib said, you can't go too deep, even let alone a foreigner coming here. If a North Indian goes to the South to cover an election or anything, there is, you know, pushback, or these Northies are parachuting. In fact, one of our colleagues, Sudipto, introduced me to a word called chom. I think it was about North Indians. So I guess that's even worse for you, is it?
Yeah, well, so that documentary, it was about, I mean, the broader story, or a big part of the India story, is obviously these issues and questions around democracy and criticisms around the silencing of dissent. And Bollywood seemed like a really key case study of that happening and how that's shifting, and filmmakers feeling really under pressure. And obviously someone like Vivek Agnihotri making these films that are accused of being propaganda and so on. So we went behind the scenes with him on his latest film. It was a really weird day. And then we did an interview with him, and you can see it all in the story. But yeah, he asked me to leave, which was also an extremely awkward interaction. And yeah, you see it also. He sort of threatens us afterwards and says there'll be repercussions if you put that out there. And so obviously that was a lot of pressure, and we faced a lot of pressure afterwards. We received legal threats afterwards as well. And, you know, as much as you don't want it to get to you, that does increase the pressure. And like Mujib said, it in some ways is an advantage, because we had lawyers just combing through the script over and over again. We did more fact checks than we would in any other story, because we just needed this to be so watertight in order to not face any backlash. Because the last thing I really want to be dealing with is a defamation case in India for the next 10 years of my life, you know. And so obviously that was a big issue, but we got the story out there, and, you know, it went quite viral, which was great. But then came the trolling, which was really, really difficult to deal with. And, you know, what I've dealt with is nothing compared to what a lot of Indian journalists deal with on a daily basis. But there were death threats, there were rape threats, there were people saying, where does she live? Can we find her? So, you know, it gets quite scary, and it is trolling. It's now part of the job. But I think, you know, it's...
Is that unique to India?
Well, it's not. In my previous work in Australia, I got trolled all the time. But what is unique to India is the sheer size. There's 1.4 billion people here compared to Australia, which is smaller than the population of Delhi. So the volume of trolling is just so intense, and the volume of that pressure is just so intense that it does get to you. But one good thing, I don't want to say it's a good thing necessarily, but that kind of public criticism makes your story more impactful. It meant it went viral. It meant you saw it when maybe you wouldn't have, because it was for an Australian audience. And I think that's one downside to this sort of targeted criticism of the media, especially the foreign media that we're seeing. You know, after the BBC raids, I wonder how many people would have watched that documentary if it wasn't headline news around the world. And obviously there were people critical of that story, but there would have been people around the world who wouldn't have known about Narendra Modi's role in the Gujarat riots or his time as chief minister, that would have been introduced to it because of that screening of that documentary. So I think there are two sides to it, and there's one very clear tactic, which is the pressure that we're feeling when we do these critical stories. But then sometimes I do question the effectiveness of that. In regards to sort of, I guess, you know, India being such a huge country and us reporting on the north and the south and everywhere, it's obviously difficult because we're not experts by any means. And I think that's where our local staff really come into fruition. And I could not do my job in any way without my local producer who I work with here. And then we hire people obviously locally on the ground. But a big issue that we're seeing there is the lack of credit for those people on the ground, the lack of acknowledgement, the lack of support for a lot of them who are freelancers here. So look, these are all issues that we're navigating, and we're trying our best to now increase the kind of credit that they're receiving and so on.
So, Mujib, the New York Times, like I said, is the favorite target. Even when going after the liberal media like NewsClick, the trigger was accused, the New York Times piece was accused of being the trigger, although I must say that that information was covered by Times a year ago. It was on the Daily Beast probably a year and a half before the New York Times mentioned it. But do you feel the burden of being the representatives of liberal Western media, and therefore when there's friendly fire, does it hurt more? And secondly, it's not just a question of foreign governments versus local governments versus your host government and your home government. Also foreign media versus legacy media in India, which really targets you. Does that kill access for you? Because they have access. Could you just deal with both these?
In terms of the access part of it, yes, because associating with us is made difficult by how much we become objects of these viral rants, right? So if there's a video that targets us as a representative of the West or something, and that video goes viral and says New York Times, New York Times, New York Times, the next time I need to talk to a mid-level official, that official will think twice because he knows what he says to the New York Times will be watched closely, right? So in that sense, it does make access difficult. In terms of what happens with our reporting or how our reporting is used, we hope not to let that drive what kind of stories we do and we don't do. And before even the NewsClick episode, I'll give you another example that happened. We wrote what we thought was a pretty simple, straightforward story about improvements in the Delhi education, okay? This became the center of a messy, partisan fight where Kejriwal held the story and he said, this is the certificate of good governance that the world has given me. And then the BJP held a press conference and they held the same front page and said, this is paid advertisement by the New York Times. And then we had BJP officials calling my colleague who had written the story, Khalistani. So in this space, I thought, where else in the world would you write a story about the improvements of education in the capital city, and you would get attacked by the central government of that country? To explain that back to our editors is a difficult thing. To deal with the trolling that comes with that, Karan, our reporter who had written that, he had to go off social media for a couple of weeks because on television he was getting called Khalistani. The things he was getting called on social media was even worse. And this was not a controversial story. So how our reporting gets used in the political debate here is slightly out of our control. And I can say the same thing about the NewsClick episode too. That was not a story about NewsClick. That was a much bigger investigation into the mogul, Roy Singham. NewsClick was 2 paragraphs in that story, And those two paragraphs, if you read it, you read the sourcing of those two paragraphs, there's actually nothing new in those two paragraphs. How the government uses a news report in a context where we know the laws are already weaponized against the media, how our story gets weaponized cannot stop us from the journalism that we do. Obviously, the pain that a lot of our colleagues felt in how that story was used, I understand that. Because I know the difficulty of the environment here that particularly our Indian colleagues work in. We have reported about the previous raid on NewsClick. Before New York Times, we have reported about the legal harassment of the independent outlets here. We have reported about the way UAPA is used against journalists. So in that context, if the government uses the New York Times story to continue to intensify a trend that is already there, we cannot let that decide what we report on, what we don't report on. So I've learned this through multiple examples that unfortunately it's a deeply polarized environment here, and our reporting, simply because the weight that the brand carries will be used often. Sometimes are real stories, sometimes fake front pages of the New York Times. You've seen this, where it says, I think there was one that said, Modi is the hope of the world. And it was, New York Times says Modi is, and this has circulated so many times, and I've gotten requests from people saying, can you verify that this is not a New York Times front page? And I said, this circulates every 2-3 months. We cannot put out a statement every single time this circulates. So we know that that will happen. There's a certain weight to that, but we hope that we can sort of block that out as we do our routine work of helping a world out there understand what are the issues here, what are the changes here. It's an exciting moment here in so many different ways. It's a complex story, probably more complex story than a lot of other places. And we hope to not let those distractions get in the way of the kind of stories we can do from here.
And I also feel like it's not the stories that you expect sometimes that get the criticism, like your version of the Delhi education story. My version of that was the moon landing, which is the most positive, exciting, fun story, right? It was this, and part of the broader other part of the India story, which is that it is this emerging technological leader. It is a growing middle class and economic leader and huge on the world stage. It's having this major moment, and that was one part of that. And I had 2-second line at the end of the story, overwhelmingly positive story, huge achievement, which said something like, there are some critics who are concerned about the spending or focus of time on this sort of space thing. Such a basic thing that some people were saying. And I got torn to shreds for that little tiny thing. And I thought, this was such an inoffensive story, and why is this the reaction to it? So it does keep you on your toes consistently.
But is it, because trolling is such an inevitable part of being in public life for anyone, whether it's a politician, whether it's a journalist, whether it's a film star, or even a sports person, who a friendly gesture of exchanging shirts becomes an issue for the social media, regulars to take off on. But does it have any consequences other than on social media? I mean, does it actually translate to any, I won't say real life, because even social media pressure can be a real life consequence, but in the sense, I mean, institutional problems or government problems or access problems, but does?
Well, I think the difference here, obviously this does happen in different countries, but what is very clear on social media here is that a lot of these accounts are either linked to the BJP or linked to Hindu right organizations or supporters of the government. And there's plenty of stories about the active social media cell and the targeting of that. And so that puts a different kind of pressure that I think trolling or social media issues in other places wouldn't have that same effect. And I think that overwhelming narrative, similar to what you said at the start, that we're like evil Western journalists, people love to put out that claim. And then there's the added thing, because I have a brown face, so they're also like, you're a race traitor. So, there's some unique, interesting things there. But it's that broader narrative of the foreign evil media that gets perpetuated through this sort of targeting.
The term used is coolie.
Yes, yeah, that's the one.
Brown seaboy.
Yeah,
Right. So, Lauren, being NPR American. Do you get any money from George Soros? No? Any of you? Because we're accused of George Soros
right
funds.
backstage right now.
Hey, Georgie, any money? Just subscribe to Newslaundry, pay to keep news free. Because, but specifically in your case, as an NPR, because it is kind of publicly funded, there is a perception, and I remember there was this entire campaign that was unleashed on social media, that it gets its money from the government. I think that is also when Elon Musk took over, that he wanted a disclosure of NPR, that it is publicly funded, and there was a pushback that an insignificant part of your funds come from the government of the United States. But because even the perception is such, and while you are here, you need the protection of your embassy. I mean, any foreign country you do. But yet, there is a fight between your organization and your home country's previously current dispensation. How do you negotiate that space? Because that's a tricky one. Here, you need your government. There, you're fighting a government.
Yeah, well, the embassy here and the State Department are not the White House and not the executive branch, but well, they are, but
it's complicated.
Yeah, I would say, so to speak to the social media thing, I had tremendous trolling, death threats. I think, like Avani said, it's part of the job now. But I never had an unkind word in person, actually. Mm-hmm. And you always, I've had nothing but a warm welcome. So we are in a country where, there is mob violence stirred up by WhatsApp forwards, and we are in a country where, there's a democratization of information, but there are people who don't have a lot of digital literacy, but have a smartphone in their hand and are on Facebook and WhatsApp and everything. And so I think there's a tremendous need for some of that digital literacy and news literacy. But yeah, all I can say is that I never had it cross that line, but it's the fear of the thing can lead to self-censorship. But as far as NPR and the US government, I would like to think we take the US government to task as much, if not more, probably certainly more than we have the Indian government. So anybody who thinks that I'm a mouthpiece for the US government or something just hasn't doesn't know what NPR is. We're publicly funded, but not government funded. I mean, we have a very small amount of funding that comes from Congress, but we're funded by private donations, foundations, and literally book clubs in the US who donate
George Soros,
to their.
No?
So yeah, we're completely independent. And you mentioned Elon Musk. NPR went off Twitter because Elon Musk labeled NPR a government-funded organization, and it was I wasn't privy to these. These were sort of top-level decisions at NPR, but we were can we survive without Twitter? It's been such a news aggregator tool for me over the years, and we've been fine. And actually probably our mental health is a lot better. So, yeah.
I think just to hop in there as well, I feel like part of our role as foreign correspondents is to act as a translator between our home countries and the country that we're reporting from. So I think part of that is to kind of question the stereotypes that perhaps readers in the UK, for me, would have about India. So I think there's an expectation from both an audience and from editors that you're going to be writing specific stories. So with India, that's a lot of poverty, that's a lot of rape cases, all of the stuff that perhaps editors are expecting the stories in India to be. And I feel like your role here is to actually come back and say, no, I live in India. What I'm seeing on the ground is totally different. There are really amazing, positive, for me, I work in development, amazing development stories which are happening here. So to kind of push back on that a little bit and straddle the line between not obviously the Indian government line, but also looking at what the UK press or the UK government is expecting to hear from India and to walk the line between the two.
And there's decades and decades of, these sort of Nat Geo covers of a faraway, frankly, quite Orientalist view that people had in the West of India. That's just It's just not the case. And I think for every American who has that Nat Geo cover, on their coffee table, they also have 5 colleagues at their job in America who are of Indian descent, and they know about India. And the sort of booming middle class, for all its inequality and for all the problems in India, for me as an American working for an American news organization, it feels there's so much that's relatable for Americans here that's not those far away poverty stories. It's not anything about that. It's about consumerism and all of the things that we've been discussing that just feels really relevant.
Okay, so before I open it out to the audience for questions, we'll have about 10 minutes of questions from the audience. The most recent case of a story that has no there's no impact. India's not a player in that story, which is what's happening in the Middle East, in Palestine and Israel. And we've seen the coverage of that. I don't know whether you have, but it's our job, so we've seen the coverage of that in India. It is deeply partisan. Not only is it partisan, it is offensive, often insane. In fact, I just saw this little clip of an Indian journalist who's she used to be with ABP. I think she's changed the channel, and she's talking to a Western media, I guess in Israel, and she's saying that the Indian government really supports it. She supports Israel, and first of all, that's not really the stated position of the Indian government per se. Secondly, why would an Indian journalist be given an interview to some other audience about Israel? But that's just where we are. In that environment, and also I personally think that the Western media's coverage of the conflict is uncomfortable for me, even with very respectable brands. In such a case, and you had the example of when you were here for COVID and you weren't vaccinated, so even your organization sent someone from overseas to cover COVID here rather than you cover it.
Not my organization, but I was seeing other Americans.
Other American, okay, not yours. So in an environment like that, let me start with you, Mujib, quickly, and then we'll move that way. 2 countries, but yet because that information is weaponized for local politics, where does that leave you in covering it? Or is that just not on your plate? It's not my problem. Let the Middle East Bureau deal with it.
I have a lot of sympathy for sort of my colleagues who are doing that, because covering the Israel-Palestine conflict is probably one of the most difficult jobs, because the passions that you see now are not new. This passion around the issue has been there the whole time. So when I see the huge amount of coverage on the US side, one part of it I could explain by saying how deeply intertwined, especially Israel, is with American politics, right? So yes, part of that is coverage of the conflict, but part of that is actually coverage of American politics, right? Because whether it's funding decisions, whether it's Congress, whether it's local politics, local congressmen, local senators, all have opinions and statements on the conflict. One thing that I think is different now, and not entirely new, but different, especially on the online coverage and the text coverage, is we are facing a problem that I think broadcast media and television media has dealt with, which is sort of on the moment, in real time coverage almost, of an issue that has a long context. If you look at the New York Times website, if you look at the Washington Post, if you look at a lot of these major papers, the way we cover big news moments right now are these live blogs where you're constantly updating on the moment the way television would in the past. That is easier to do when it's a train crash, right? You can focus on what is in front of you. You can focus on a little bit of context. That is much harder to do when it's a conflict with 75 years of history, when the 2 players in the conflict both traumatized. One is a nation born out of the trauma of the Holocaust and those crimes. Another is a people that is suffering because of the policies of this new nation. And that how do you inject context while you are TikTok covering every little moment and every development, right? So I can say it's those two things. The other is, and I want to highlight this because some of my friends send me these, you guys have probably seen this too, these 3 screenshots of the New York Times headline on the hospital bombing, the change in the headlines. Those of us who are in the news business would know that the nature of this live coverage means that we probably change a headline a dozen times on a story during the day, based on the new information that comes, right? Anybody who followed that hospital bombing could see how the story changed during the day. The headline changes based on that. But for an outside reader, that is seen as an indication of an ideological decision made by the New York Times to water down a headline, right? So I think the coverage of a deeply polarized and emotional issue like that is in part complicated by the nature of live news coverage, and in part complicated by how we struggle to communicate that to the reader, that a lot of these choices that you think might be agenda-driven are actually routine practices of news coverage, that we change things as things develop.
I wanted to jump in about, watching local media coverage of some of these conflicts. I went to Ukraine in the opening days of the war there, flew from Mumbai and crossed in from Poland. And, at the time, the US media was covering this as such a black and white issue, the Ukrainian suffering, the unprovoked attack by Russia. And I met up with Indian colleagues there. Indian media had, it was one of the big stories that Indian media sent TV crews in, and I met up with, oh, hey, I live in India, and I started to watch the way the Indian media was covering it. It was very different. And rather than, that was actually a real learning moment for me, because I think, talk about this Asia pivot. This was a term that the Obama administration used. All of us who've been based in Asia are screaming there are so many important stories here, and there's constant attention to these Western conflicts, and Israel-Gaza is one, and Ukraine was one. But when I came out of Ukraine, covering for about 6 weeks the suffering of Ukraine, and I came back to India, and I realized my Indian friends were not on the same page as the Western media. That was a real wake-up call to the rest of the world does not share the Western point of view of this conflict. And it's really helpful for me to be in India and to bring that perspective to my listeners and to my news organization, because, and this Asia pivot, whenever there's a war that breaks out in Israel or Ukraine, the attention goes back to the West. And, being here, having lived here for 5 years, and I shifted away 6 months ago and coming back these past 2 weeks, the optimism that I sense here, I live in a place now that its heyday was in past centuries. And you feel that just in your coverage. And that's not the case here. And the more we can get Western media to center an outlook in Asia and in South Asia, it's just, look at the numbers. It's just more realistic.
Catherine?
I don't feel like I can speak to Gaza or Ukraine at all, but I think it comes back to what Mujib is saying about about not having literacy, perhaps audiences back home not having literacy on the longer story, the history of everything. And I think when it comes to India coverage, that is really tricky, because how do you fit all of the context into, often it's 1,000 words, 1,500 words? It's a really difficult thing to do, to not bore your reader before you get to the second paragraph, but then to also provide enough context so that people fully understand the history of everything that's gone on. And I think that's something I'm particularly perhaps conscious of as a Brit in India. Hopefully all of my stories do kind of like consider the context of who I am reporting here and the British history in India, especially when it comes to India's development story. But yeah, I think it's a tricky thing to include that history in such a small space that we often have, and shorten attention spans as well with readerships. So,
Okay, Avani, the question to you is, your Prime Minister, at one stage he was asked because he said something about Prime Minister Modi that was very complimentary, and then
The boss.
the boss,
Yeah,
right? And then
comparing
he
him
said,
to
chill
Bruce
out.
Springsteen. Yeah,
And
yeah.
that chill out got a lot of pushback here. Did you feel compelled or duty bound to defend your Prime Minister? Or does he have his own IT cell to do it for him?
It has been so fascinating and bizarre watching the Australian government's approach to India in the last few years, because obviously India is having this huge moment. Australia, like many Western countries, pivoting away from China, moving towards India. And then early in the year, I was, on the tour with Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister, and then suddenly we see him in a chariot with Prime Minister Modi, and it was like, are we watching the Hunger Games? What is happening here? That was bizarre. And then, Modi goes to the stadium in Sydney, 20,000 people cheering, and Albanese says, you're the boss. And then the India-Canada issue happens, and a journalist says, do you regret that comment? And he said, can you just chill out? So this whole thing feels like a bit of a fever dream, to be honest, to be watching. But I think what has been fascinating to watch, so I'm the only journalist for an Australian publication based in South Asia, and every time the Prime Minister comes here, which is now increasing in amount, a huge press pack comes from Australia. And on that day when they were at the cricket stadium, a journalist asked Prime Minister Albanese a question, and he told me after, he said, I felt impolite not asking Modi a question. So I asked him a question, something really soft, something like, how does it feel to have the Australian Prime Minister here? And Modi sort of mumbled under his breath. And then we got a bit of a talking to, no questions to Modi. And that was set very clearly. And it was fascinating seeing all these journalists coming from Australia and being utterly shocked that this is a so-called democracy and you can't go up to the leader and ask questions. And I thought, I haven't even been here for that long, but I've already been like, of course you can't ask questions. Of course there's no press conferences.
You internalize it.
I've internalized it. And then I realized, this is a bit weird. And so I think it's really interesting that governments like Australia are really drinking the Kool-Aid when it comes to India. They're not openly criticizing. I ask the Prime Minister, ministers these questions about issues around democracy. They refuse to acknowledge it. And then we see these things playing out in real time. So it's been fascinating to watch that.
It's amazing that
So-
you're the only Australian
I know,
correspondent
it's
based
bizarre.
in South Asia.
Yeah.
We have time for a couple of questions, right? 10 minutes, okay, great. So let's start with the gentleman with the beard who was the first to raise his hand. Fastest finger first, सबसे पहला सवाल आपका.
Thank you very much. Has language been a problem for your work here?
I don't speak Hindi very well at all.
Dhanya is going to get angry. Hindi is not the only language
Sorry,
spoken
no,
here.
but I'm-
There's Tamil,
I'm
there's
about to
Telugu,
say
there's
that. I'm about
Malayalam.
to say that.
Dhanya, cancelled. She's cancelled.
I think the importance of Hindi has grown in the past 6 years since I moved here. When I first moved here, I thought, I'm going to work at Hindi, but I'm also going to learn some Marathi because I was living in Mumbai. And I thought, well, I'm flying out to a different state every week. I'm hiring local journalists to help me. So I didn't put the effort into Hindi that perhaps I should have. And if I were going to do it again, I think the importance of Hindi has grown in the past 6 years, for this government at least. I was invited to a New Year's party in Delhi a couple years ago that the MEA organized, and the Minister of External Affairs came out and spoke to all the foreign journalists gathered and addressed us in Hindi. She
Right.
could speak English.
Seems deliberate.
I think I've found that it does help the sort of at least understanding of the language. It may not. I speak and understand Hindi, but the background that I have in language is actually Urdu. So the vocabulary I struggle with, because actually the Hindi vocabulary that is being used is changing quite dramatically right now. But where I do find the language helpful is on the streets and in the villages, where it is still largely the older vocabulary. So in formal settings and with the limitations that Abhinandan mentioned, that in large parts of the country that doesn't help me, but in the places that they do, it is more about just getting the color, the tone of a place by just listening in, whereas my ability to have complicated conversations in Hindi may be limited because of that vocabulary issue.
And to be honest, not being fluent in the language of the country didn't stop George Bush from running his country efficiently. Because I used to write a political satire show at the time, and we had to come up with words he invented. Like The Office, the guy makes up his own words.
We thought he was the worst we were going to get.
Sorry, which one?
We thought he was the worst we were going to get.
Oh, right, yeah. But yeah, another question. Okay, there's one here. You stay there.
Is there any political pressure that you face from the government, like from the stories that are critical, like from the other, like what happened with NewsClick and all? Does that make you fearful of the future of foreign media in India?
From the home government or their home government? Our home government. Yes. Does it make you
the
fearful?
Indian government?
Yes.
I've, there's the occasional talking to, but I haven't faced anything beyond that. But I think what we are seeing is consistent pressure and issues around correspondence visas and, the BBC situation. And I think what that's done is create more of a climate of concern and fear around these issues, that it could happen to you in a way that does influence and make you think a bit more about how you're reporting and what you're doing.
All right, we have a question at the back. This young lady here, and just a little higher up. I can't often see this. Yeah, just identify yourself, please.
Yeah, hi. So a little context. BBC recently ran an article on what happened in Canada and the Indian-Canadian conflict, right? So the backlash that they got for that was that BBC was being a hypocrite in the words that they chose to use for the alleged assassination. So how do you combat that, the allegation that the West is always has a double standard when it criticizes India?
Who'd like to take that? First of all, do you think it has a double standard at all? I mean, do you agree with that thesis? I think inevitably there will, in some issues, be a double standard.
I think historically there has been that reflects in the language used in the past as well. There might be times now that there is a lapse in the language as well. That sort of the remnants of that kind of thinking and biases do come in, but largely speaking, I struggle when the accusation is that sort of Western double standard, right? I write the story from here. As Abhinandan was saying here, I'm not American. I speak very little to the American government. I determine what language gets used, right? So I usually, that criticism, I see it as part of the same broader campaign to try to discredit the point of a story, to muddy the waters, that, as we saw in an earlier presentation, right? That a lot of it is really for political use rather than fair. There are times that some of the accusations are fair in terms of the lapse of language, the lens that we put on a story, but most of the times actually it is part of the same agenda to discredit and to confuse the space and to continue labeling rather than actually something fair to say.
I think also from the UK, the US, Australia, they're all sucking up to India. And I think the Australian government would want us to be doing positive stories about India. They would not be wanting us to do these critical stories. And obviously we do a mix, but I don't think they want those stories to be covered as much as they are. So this idea of this Western conspiracy and so on is really unfounded.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, on the day of the BBC tax raids in India, I believe Prime Minister Modi was on the phone with Biden, Macron, and Rishi Sunak, sealing the deal for the Airbus, Boeing, and Rolls-Royce Air India planes. And all three of those world leaders were not paying attention and not speaking out on the BBC tax raids. They were celebrating this deal with the Prime Minister, and that was a brilliant stroke of diplomacy on Modi's part. But if we are doing stories about human rights or whatever, those are inconvenient for our governments rather than, supporting or,
I cannot emphasize this point enough that I feel like this is the reality, that actually part of the pushback that the Western media faces might be from local here. A lot of it is actually because of the inconvenience the Western governments face. If you look at a lot of the reports that traditionally would be critical of India on human rights issues, on press freedom issues, right? The reports that have anything to do with these governments, you've seen that those reports have toned down. Those reports end up in sort of some page 300 now, right? That the only voices that you hear constantly raising these issues and saying, yes, trade is great. Yes, India's economic growth is it's inevitable, right? But both things are happening at the same time. There are things happening to the democracy here as well, that we looked away from China because of China's economic potential, because of how convenient that relationship was, until you reached a headache. And if an ally, if a partner is headed towards the same direction, to look away from things that are happening is just repeating the same mistake. So the Western media a lot of times stands out, not just because the Indian media doesn't raise a lot of those issues anymore, but also because the Western governments don't raise those issues anymore.
Okay, quickly, we've run out of time, so let's have that question really quick.
Fine. Greetings, everyone. So the question is, whenever a tragedy unfolds with a minority community in the western side of the world, it is covered so intensively by the Indian media that it feels, even though I'm a non-native, it feels like something has happened next door. But it is not the same case when something happens in India itself. Our own media turns a blind eye to it, rest alone the Western media to it. So being a non-native resident of the Indian state yourself, how do you view it as?
Right. Do you think it's over or underdone?
You mean
like for if an
communal
Indian is killed in
tensions,
America or a Muslim is killed, Indian is killed in America, it becomes a big thing here. But here, if there is a minority attacked, it's not covered at all.
I think that we face a lot of issues. A good example of this is Manipur, where we just can't get in. And so that is a huge issue around violence against minorities and so on. And we aren't getting permits to go there. And so that means the story isn't being covered in the same way. We're doing it remotely. And it means that our editors aren't investing in us going there. So the stories aren't getting the same priority in the bulletins and so on. And I think that is a big restriction, where Kashmir is the same issue as well. So a lot of that minority violence is happening in places that we can't go to because the government is not responding to our permit applications. So that's been a really big difficulty as a correspondent.
Yeah, I would say I always say covering India and South Asia is an exercise in feeling completely inadequate as a journalist, because it's a fire hose and there's so much to prioritize. And I need to, just the numbers, some of us cover all of South Asia, including Pakistan and Afghanistan and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. It's literally a quarter of humanity that is our patch. And I'm one correspondent and one producer covering. So we have to make really hard decisions, and it's difficult. And we do try to cover that minority violence, and we also try to cover the environmental apocalypse, and we also try to cover the China border. And so it's really, really hard. And sometimes when you feel like there's a tinderbox that's about to explode, you want that last lynching story, you want the last story you do to be about that lynching, because otherwise you're off doing some beautiful little story about some electric car someplace, or electric, and you're caught out. And so it's really, really difficult to know what to prioritize and when.
If I can just add one thing to this, I think the case that Sanjay mentioned this morning of the kid who was stabbed to death in the US, right? If you see the reaction to that, that the President of the United States puts out a statement condemning it, although his entire energy has been focused on standing with Israel, right? The US cycle, the local media, ends up covering incidents like that does happen, right? One thing that it's very difficult to explain to colleagues here when that whataboutery comes in on issues such as that is that there's such desensitization here to the routineness of that kind of violence, right? That is actually not there in a lot of these other places. The violence happens, but there's the process around the violence, whether it's the coverage of it, whether it is the rule of law part of it, does kick in those places. Whereas here, unfortunately, a good chunk of this violence has become routine. The news coverage of it has been desensitized to it even. I've had colleagues tell me, because I've only been here 2.5 years, saying 5 years ago, 7 years ago, lynching stories wouldn't make it to the front page of coverage here. Now, you might find a paragraph on the last page or right tucked in the middle, right? So a part of this is the hyper-nationalism getting extended to finding episodes far away, whereas those episodes actually do get covered in the local press there. Those episodes do get the reaction of local politicians there, whereas a lot of times the same does not happen here.
Or it goes the other way. But thank you so much, panel, for taking the time, making it an engaging discussion. And before you guys go back to your home countries, go to Pakistan. Thank you all.